Cauchi. But now I'm going to open our session this morning that really is a chance for us to listen to and ask some questions of our politicians who care about this space. So this morning we're going to start with, we have the three leaders of the major parties in relation to international development, and to kick us off is Senator Richard Di Natale, the leader of the Australian Greens. Before being elected to this role in 2010, Senator Di Natale worked as a general practitioner and general health specialist focusing on Aboriginal health, HIV prevention in India and the drug and alcohol sector. Some of his parliamentary achievements and priorities regard public dental care, superbugs, air pollution and pharmaceutical transparency. We were very grateful to have Richard speak to us last year, so this is his second year addressing us, and I'm delighted to welcome him to the stage, and he'll be taking questions at the conclusion of his address. Please welcome Senator Richard Di Natale.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you to ACFID for the opportunity to speak to you again this morning. Let me begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their custodianship and enduring relationship with this great country of ours. Let me also acknowledge Senator Moore. Senator Moore and I often sit together in the Community Affairs Committee. I suspect if you took us out of our tribes, we'd agree on almost everything. Many things. Senator Fierravanti-Wells, who I understand is speaking shortly. Let me also acknowledge all of you. Thank you so much for all the work that you do, for the huge contribution that you make. As I was saying to Sam earlier, there are some events that you do because you're the leader of a political party and it's important that our views are represented. And there are some events that you feel deeply passionate about, and this is one of those. It's a real privilege for me to be able to talk to you today. I spoke to you, I think, a year ago now, and it was just after 193 members of the United Nations signed up to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Goals are ambitious. They set out a plan to end poverty by 2030, leaving no one behind. And I spoke to you last year about the urgent need to increase Australia's aid budget from historic lows, and we announced our policy, the Greens policy, for our overseas aid commitment to reach 0.7% of GDP by 2025. Now, it's a goal that's been agreed to by the Labor Party. Indeed, it was agreed to by John Howard when he was Prime Minister, and they've, at least all notionally, said that this is a target that they support. Sadly, we're a long way from that. And I think we need to start reframing this debate, because I've always believed that for a country like ours to be able to offer assistance and support, it's a sign of strength and not weakness, for us to be able to reach out to those people in need. And it's an opportunity for us to show that we're a generous nation, that we're engaged with the world, indeed with the region, rather than where we are at the moment, which is an isolationist, miserly approach to global issues. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The sad thing is that a year on from the speech I gave to you, not much has changed. Despite the Turnbull government's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, our aid budget is now at the lowest it's been ever. The lowest ever our aid budget has been in history. So if you think about it, and you all know these statistics, if GDP was $100 in our back pocket, we'd be giving 23 cents at the moment to the most vulnerable people on earth. You'll be told that we can't afford it, that the Greens policy is not achievable, but you just need to see what's happening right around the world. Countries like Norway, Sweden and Denmark, they got to that 0.7% target years ago. We saw the UK achieve 0.7% of GDP in 2013, enshrined in legislation, done under a Conservative government on the back of a global financial crisis that hit the UK much harder than it hit Australia. So here we are, one of the richest nations on earth, where successive governments have been raiding the aid budget because they don't think there are any votes in it. It's something, again, I'll come to in a moment. We saw the Abbott-Turnbull government gut aid now to the tune of $11 billion since 2013, $11 billion. But of course, That's on the back of cuts that were implemented by the previous Labor government, $5.8 billion slashed under that government. And of course, what often happens is we see the door open by Labor governments and the coalition charge through it. The government's not just devastating the quantum of aid funding. It's not just about the money, it's also about how we use our aid dollars. And what we've seen now is that it seems to be the primary purpose of our aid funding is to further Australia's national interest rather than to assist people in the region. The Foreign Minister's indicated that the government's using aid to further Australia's economic interests. And it's a perversion, I think, of the notion that the core purpose of aid funding is to help lift people out of poverty, to build capacity, to give people opportunities, not just to promote our own national, political or commercial interests. Of course, what we saw again under the previous government was $460 million in foreign aid used to expand the Manus Island Detention Centre. I mean, just think about that. Funds that were meant to help the world's most vulnerable people were being used to incarcerate them. Now, I could give you all sorts of good economic arguments about why it's important to provide increased assistance. I could give you national security arguments, but sitting above that, I think, is just a clear moral question. And is it right that a country like ours doesn't do more to help some of the most vulnerable people in the world, and certainly many of them living in our region? And of course, when you factor in our current approach to climate change, which poses a huge threat, not just to countries like Australia, but especially to people living in extreme poverty. So many of the gains that we've already made will be wiped out if we don't do something and start getting serious about tackling dangerous global warming. The Sustainable Development Goals recognise this. They recognise that climate change is playing an increasingly important role in driving poverty, hunger, inequality, disease, conflict and displacement. Now, Senator Fierravanti-Wells, I suspect will talk later about how the Australian region is one of the most disaster-prone in the world. She's right. Climate change, though, will expose hundreds of millions of people within our region to the risk of coastal flooding by 2025. We know that. We're going to see more extreme droughts, floods, cyclones, and other extreme weather events. They're not just going to hit agriculture, but they're going to disproportionately affect the world's poorest people. We saw it recently with the hurricane in Haiti. Yet what's our plan here to get on track to the 1.5 degree reduction in global temperatures? We don't have one. And while we'll hear that the Coalition have committed $1 billion to climate and disaster resilience and reducing emissions, it's just an exercise in shuffling around funds in an already depleted aid budget. What we need is a plan to get to zero emissions. The Greens have got one. We want to get to zero emissions by 2040. We've got a costed plan, a detailed plan for how we do that and how we manage that transition justly. We want to see an increase in climate finance funding, $3.6 billion by 2019-2020. That's on top of our commitment to reach 0.7% of GNI over the next 10 years. Of course, we need to get the governance structures right, and that's why we've committed to re-establishing an independent department to oversee delivery and effectiveness, to ensure we've got a greater focus on the things that we know work, issues that we know are important, issues like health and so on. And we'd see a whole range of the programs that have been dismantled under the current government, programs like those operating in Africa and the Middle East, we'd see them re-established. But the big question, I suppose, for you as a sector is, how do we actually achieve that? How do we achieve it? We think that the aid and development sector's got a critical role to play in the face of government cuts, in the face of a government which has elevated national interest as the primary purpose of Australia's aid funding. So it's really more important than ever that you spend this time reflecting on how community campaigns and the work that you do allow us to build a more compassionate and generous country. And I mean, I didn't have the privilege of listening to Bob speak last night, but I won't be able to regale you with stories of Chunky Creek the early days of Bob's activism, but let me just say that it is absolutely critical that the story of the work that you do is something that's heard by the Australian community. I don't get it. I don't understand why this is a easy political target. For many of us in this room, we know that the work that you do is just so critical. But there is a real challenge for us. How do we ensure that people right across the country don't see this as an easy political target? How is it that the notion that charity begins at home has taken hold in Australia when we have had a long tradition of supporting the most vulnerable people in the region? So it is critical that you reflect on how you as a sector can ensure that your voices are heard both in the corridors of Parliament but also within the national debate. And that's a big, big challenge that lies ahead of you. I think the other challenge is to ensure that you don't fall for the trap of low expectations. I think all too often in the public debate, and I've seen it in a number of areas, we see people who are operating within the non-government sector argue for what they think's politically possible rather than for what they believe to be the right policy outcome. I think it's a mistake. It's my view that the negotiation and compromise should be left to politicians. Your job as a sector is to continue to argue for what you believe is the right policy outcome. Don't lower your expectations. Don't allow any government to limit the possibilities of what can be achieved. So I was really pleased to see ACFID in the lead up to the election argue very strongly for all parties to restore Australian aid to reach the 0.7% target by 2030, to scale up new climate finance funding and to implement the Paris Agreement. And I hope you'll continue to campaign strongly in that space. You'll be told that we can't afford it, that we have other priorities, that the budget is in bad shape and that we need to make cuts across a range of other areas. But let's recognise that budgets just aren't about making the books add up. They're actually a reflection of our values, of our priorities as a nation. We can afford to be generous and compassionate. We can achieve that 0.7% target by 2025. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it will cost over $7.9 billion if we're to start that process soon, and it's costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. That's obviously a reflection of how much the aid budget's already been cut. But let's also recognise that we have the opportunity to do that if we end some of those huge unfair tax breaks that already exist within our system. Why is it that we're providing cheap fuel to the mining industry? Why is it that we continue to allow people tax breaks to buy their third or fourth or fifth property while people attempting to get into the property market for the first time are squeezed out? Why is it that we are the only country on earth that would cut a price on pollution when most other countries understand the economic as well as environmental imperative in reducing our carbon emissions? Why is it that we have subsidies that, for example, prop up the private health insurance industry when we could be providing frontline services in a much more efficient and fairer way? There are so many areas within our budget that we should be looking at that allow us to create a more compassionate, more caring, more egalitarian country that also go some way to reducing the great gap that exists within Australia in terms of income inequality and within nations. Now, as well as meeting our international obligations on aid, our budget would also do things like expand Medicare-funded dental care. We think that that's critical. We'd put more money into renewable energy. Rather than cutting $500 million from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, we'd like to see that as a hub of innovation that allows us to export new and innovative renewable energy technologies to the region. If we can get our off-grid technologies through the combination of smart grids, battery storage, innovative generation technologies, why can't we ensure that we export those technologies within the region and give people the energy security and independence that they need? Some of them for the very first time. Every step of the way in the budget discussion that we have, there are choices to be made. And let's not be fooled into thinking that the only choices that are ahead of us are ones that make life harder for ordinary people and harder for some of the most vulnerable people on earth. Unfortunately, I do think we are now in the midst of an unprecedented retreat. We've become inward-looking and public debate has become narrow. And what we're seeing, not just on issues like international development and foreign aid, but on global warming, on human rights, on the treatment of asylum seekers, is a debate that I think demeans us all. It doesn't have to be this way. These are global issues. They require global leadership and cooperation. And that's something that we commit to doing. As I've outlined, our policy when it comes to international aid and development is one that's sustainable financially, but also has a moral imperative sitting underneath it. And we look forward to working with you in ensuring that we have a more generous, a more effective, a more transparent and a much better funded aid program for Australia. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. We're running a little bit over time, but I think it would be nice if there was one question that people had that we could deal with quickly. And I know that you're around through to morning tea. Yeah, so Richard will be around at morning tea, so there is a chance to have a chat with him as well. There we go.
Hi, my name is Craig Margetson. I'm from the Salvation Army's International Development Program. My question is, what do you think about dropping the term aid and replacing that with the term development? Could this assist in changing the public perception that this work is a handout and more akin to welfare, as opposed to development, which can be seen more as a hand up or an investment in our global partners?
So there's probably two answers to that question. The first one is, my opinion is probably less important than what evidence shows on that. So my view is it makes sense to do that. I think the sort of justification that you've offered in your question makes sense to me intuitively, and I've often thought that perhaps part of the issue is that we need to highlight that this isn't simply providing people money, but actually it's about building capacity. But in the end, it's not really my opinion that matters on this. I think what you want to do is you want to answer that question empirically. You need to ensure that you get people in the room who are communications experts, who can test that hypothesis and can actually give you an answer. Because it's not me you're trying to convince. This is something that needs to not resonate with me, or in fact with the people in this room, but it needs to resonate with the broader community. And this is where doing some research to see what language connects with people is really critical. And I think that's something that often, we find this in politics all the time, and it's true of a number of groups who work within the NGO sector. We don't want to talk to ourselves. We need to make sure we're talking to the people who we're trying to shift on this. And so my advice would be test it. Work with the communications organisation who can help you answer that question empirically.
Could you thank Richard again? As I said, we'll be here during the